Zoe Carter had mastered the art of moving through the executive floors without drawing attention to herself, a skill learned over years of quiet observation and disciplined restraint. She walked with purpose but never haste, confidence without spectacle, the kind of professional presence that rarely made headlines yet held entire systems together. On that particular afternoon, the glass corridors of Knight Global Solutions reflected her image back at her in fragments. Tailored navy blazer, structured tote, hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, every detail carefully chosen to communicate seriousness in a world that often mistook silence for weakness. Zoe had not arrived at her position by chance. She had built it piece by piece, hour by hour, through early mornings, late nights, and a stubborn refusal to be underestimated. Yet even with all that discipline, there were parts of her life she kept hidden, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. In environments like this, she had learned, perception could matter as much as performance. Julian Knight occupied the top floor of the building both physically and symbolically, a man whose name was spoken with a mix of admiration and caution. As founder and CEO, he was known less for charisma and more for consistency, the kind of leader who listened longer than he spoke and remembered details others dismissed as trivial. His rise from a modest background to the head of a multinational firm had not been flashy, but it had been relentless, guided by principles that had earned him trust across every level of the organization. Julian did not believe in favoritism, and he did not blur boundaries, a reputation that made him respected and, at times, feared. Zoe had interacted with him dozens of times in meetings and project reviews, always professional, always focused, yet there was an unspoken recognition between them that neither acknowledged. He noticed her precision. She noticed his restraint. In a building full of noise, they were both quiet forces. That day, Zoe had returned from a brief lunch break earlier than usual, timing her arrival to avoid the crowded elevators and casual chatter that drained her more than deadlines ever did. Tucked inside her tote, alongside reports and a tablet, was a small, carefully wrapped box from a boutique several blocks away. It was not extravagant, nor inappropriate, but it was deeply personal, an item she had debated purchasing for weeks and finally bought on impulse, driven by a desire to reclaim a part of herself she often set aside. The purchase was not for anyone else. It was a reminder that she existed beyond spreadsheets and strategy decks, beyond performance metrics and quarterly goals. Zoe did not normally allow such impulses, but something about that afternoon had felt heavy, as if her carefully controlled world needed a quiet release. The hallway on the executive floor was empty, polished stone floors echoing softly beneath her steps as she adjusted the weight of her bag. Her phone vibrated with an incoming message, and as she shifted her grip to reach it, the unexpected happened. The small box slipped free, hitting the floor with a muted sound before its contents slid partially into view. Time seemed to pause in that narrow corridor, the kind of pause that felt louder than any noise. Zoe's breath caught as she registered what had happened, her first instinct not embarrassment, but fear, not of exposure, but of interpretation. She moved quickly to retrieve the fallen item, crouching down with a sharp intake of breath, her mind racing through consequences that had not yet occurred but felt inevitable all the same. She was halfway through gathering everything when she sensed another presence, a shift in the air that made her look up before she wanted to. Julian Knight stood a few steps away, having turned into the hallway at precisely the wrong moment. His expression was neutral, but his attention was unmistakable, not invasive, not judgmental, simply present. He bent down and picked up the item she had missed, holding it carefully as if aware that it carried more weight than its appearance suggested. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken assumptions, the kind of silence that could shape narratives if left unattended. Julian broke it gently, his tone calm, almost conversational, yet direct in the way only he could manage. "Is this yours?" he asked, not accusing, not amused, simply curious. Zoe felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the reflexive response of someone who had learned that honesty, while noble, was not always safe. In that instant, her mind calculated outcomes with ruthless efficiency. The truth would invite speculation. Clarification would invite curiosity. Curiosity, in this environment, often turned into stories that no explanation could fully erase. So she did what she had done before when corners closed in around her. She chose the version of reality that felt least dangerous. "Yes," she replied, standing and taking it from him, her voice steady despite the tension running through her. "It's a gift." The words slipped out easily, too easily, forming the foundation of a lie she had not planned but instinctively constructed. Julian's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, not in suspicion, but in assessment, as though he sensed the careful calculation beneath her composure. He nodded once, accepting her answer without comment, yet something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like a door quietly closing. Before either of them could say more, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway as a pair of employees approached, their conversation faltering when they noticed the scene. Zoe felt the heat of awareness spread across her face, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she understood how quickly moments could be misinterpreted when witnessed without context. Julian straightened, his posture returning to the controlled authority that defined him in public spaces, and handed the item back to her with professional detachment. "The leadership review starts in 20 minutes, he said evenly. "I'll see you there." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a corridor filled with quiet assumptions and a woman standing very still, her heart beating far too loudly for an empty floor. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and muted conversations, yet the incident followed Zoe like a shadow she could not shake. She was acutely aware of glances that lingered a second too long, of voices lowering when she entered a room, of the unspoken narratives beginning to form in spaces she could not control. None of it was overt, and that was what made it dangerous. She had spent years proving that her value lay in her work, her insight, her reliability. One moment, one misunderstood scene, threatened to unravel that perception, not because it reflected reality, but because reality often mattered less than what people chose to believe. Julian, for his part, returned to his office unsettled in a way he did not immediately understand. He was not bothered by what he had seen, but by what he had felt, a sense that Zoe Carter was guarding something with the same intensity she brought to her work. He respected boundaries, yet he could not ignore the awareness that the truth she had offered was incomplete. Still, he did not pursue it. Leadership, he believed, was as much about restraint as it was about action. If there was more to the story, it would reveal itself in time. As evening fell and the building slowly emptied, Zoe remained at her desk, staring at numbers that no longer held meaning. The item she had retrieved lay hidden once more, but the lie she had spoken lingered, heavier than she expected. She told herself it was necessary, that she had protected herself, her career, the future she had worked so hard to secure. Yet beneath that rationalization was a quieter realization, one she was not ready to confront fully. In choosing safety, she had also chosen distance, and in that hallway, without intending to, she had set something in motion that could not simply be undone. The story of who she was, and who she might become, had shifted, not because of what had fallen to the floor, but because of the fear that had guided her hand when she reached for it. The days following the hallway incident unfolded with a strange, suffocating normalcy that unsettled Zoe Carter more than open confrontation ever could have. Nothing had officially changed, yet everything felt different. Conversations paused when she approached, then resumed with forced casualness. Colleagues who once greeted her with easy familiarity now measured their words, their eyes flicking briefly toward her before looking away. It was not hostility she sensed, but curiosity sharpened into quiet speculation, the most dangerous kind in a corporate environment built on perception and hierarchy. Zoe had always understood that success did not shield a woman from scrutiny. Sometimes it invited more of it. Still, experiencing it firsthand, knowing it stemmed from a single moment stripped of context, weighed heavily on her discipline. She refused to react, refused to explain herself unprompted, because she knew that doing so would only feed narratives that thrived on fragments and half-truths. Julian Knight noticed the shift as well, though from a different vantage point. From the glass-walled conference rooms and executive briefings, he observed patterns most overlooked, subtle changes in tone and behavior that revealed more than quarterly reports ever could. He saw how Zoe continued to perform with unwavering excellence, how her presentations remained sharp and her strategies precise, yet there was a new restraint in her presence, a guardedness that had not been there before. Julian was not a man given to impulsive conclusions, but experience had taught him that environments often reflected leadership choices, even when leaders were not directly involved. He questioned whether his own silence had contributed to the quiet tension growing around her, and whether intervention, however delicate, might be necessary. Zoe, meanwhile, retreated further into her work, arriving earlier and leaving later, filling every spare moment with tasks that justified her presence and reaffirmed her value. At home, The silence pressed in, leaving her alone with thoughts she carefully avoided during the day. She replayed the hallway moment in her mind, not with embarrassment anymore, but with frustration at herself for choosing fear over clarity. Yet each time she considered correcting the lie, her resolve faltered. The corporate world was not forgiving, and she had seen careers subtly derailed not by incompetence, but by whispers that attached themselves to women who dared to exist beyond rigid expectations. Zoe told herself that enduring discomfort now was preferable to risking long-term damage, that silence was still the safest option. As the week progressed, a new project was announced, one that would define the company's strategic direction for years to come. It required a leader with both vision and operational mastery, someone capable of navigating complex teams and high-stakes decisions. When Julian assigned Zoe to head the initiative, the room fell briefly silent. The decision was objectively sound, her track record spoke for itself, but Zoe could feel the unspoken questions ripple outward. She accepted the role without hesitation, her voice steady, her posture composed, determined to let her work speak louder than doubt. Yet inside, she understood the challenge had doubled. She was no longer just delivering results, she was defending her credibility in an environment eager to test it. Julian watched her closely during those meetings, not as a superior scrutinizing performance, but as a leader gauging resilience. He admired her composure, the way she navigated complex discussions without asserting dominance, earning cooperation through clarity rather than force. Still, he could not ignore the lingering sense that she carried a burden unrelated to the project itself. Julian believed in accountability, and though he respected her privacy, he also believed that unresolved tension, left unchecked, could erode even the strongest foundations. He began to consider whether a private conversation was warranted, not to challenge her, but to ensure that the culture he had worked so hard to build did not quietly fail someone who embodied its values. Zoe sensed his attention, though nothing explicit was said. It unsettled her, not because she feared his judgment, but because she feared her own reaction if he pressed further. She respected Julian deeply, not just as a CEO, but as a person whose integrity was evident in every decision. That respect made the lie heavier, more corrosive, because it stood in opposition to everything she believed about herself. Yet fear remained the louder voice, reminding her of stories she had witnessed, of women whose professionalism was overshadowed by assumptions once boundaries blurred, regardless of truth. Zoe promised herself that once the project stabilized, once her position felt unassailable again, she would find a way to set things right. Until then, she would endure. The pressure culminated late one evening when Zoe remained alone in the office, the city lights glowing faintly beyond the windows as she reviewed final projections. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that invited reflection rather than distraction. When she finally stood to leave, she noticed the faint reflection of Julian's office light still on across the corridor. It struck her then how leadership isolated as much as it empowered, how both of them, in different ways, were navigating expectations imposed by others. The realization did not resolve her conflict, but it softened it, reminding her that strength did not always mean certainty, and that courage often waited just beyond the edge of fear. As Zoe stepped into the night, she carried with her the understanding that the lie she had told was no longer just about avoiding scrutiny. It had become a barrier between who she was and who she wanted to be. Part of her sensed that the coming days would force a reckoning, that silence could only hold for so long before truth demanded space. She did not yet know how she would respond when that moment arrived, only that whatever choice she made would shape more than her career. It would define her integrity, and perhaps, the future she had spent so long trying to protect. By the time the new strategic initiative entered its critical phase, the tension that had quietly threaded itself through Zoe Carter's days could no longer be ignored, even by those who preferred to look away. The project demanded cross-departmental alignment, late-night decisions, and an unusual level of transparency, placing Zoe at the center of conversations where influence and credibility mattered more than titles ever could. She handled the pressure with the same controlled excellence that had defined her career, yet beneath that composure, the weight of unresolved perception pressed harder with each passing day. Zoe understood something fundamental had shifted since the hallway incident, not in the way people spoke to her directly, but in the way they watched, evaluated, and silently measured her. It was a reminder of how fragile reputations could be, and how quickly years of effort could be questioned by moments stripped of context and left to interpretation. Julian Knight found himself increasingly drawn into the gravity of the situation, not because of rumor, but because of responsibility. As the leader of the organization, he took culture personally, believing that the environment he cultivated reflected his values more accurately than any public statement ever could. He noticed how discussions subtly changed when Zoe entered a room, how voices softened or sharpened without obvious reason, how decisions that once flowed smoothly now carried an undercurrent of hesitation. Julian was not blind to power dynamics, nor was he unaware of how easily silence from leadership could be mistaken for indifference. The thought unsettled him. He had built Knight Global Solutions on the principle that merit mattered, that integrity was not optional, and that success earned through discipline deserved protection, not suspicion. If something within his organization threatened that principle, even quietly, it demanded attention. The opportunity for that attention came during a late evening review session, one scheduled long after most employees had left for the day. Zoe sat across from Julian in a conference room bathed in the muted glow of city lights, spreadsheets projected between them as they discussed final adjustments to the rollout plan. The conversation was professional, efficient, yet beneath it ran an unspoken awareness that neither could ignore. When the last point was settled and silence settled in its place, Julian did not immediately stand. Instead, he closed his laptop and looked at Zoe with an expression that was thoughtful rather than interrogative, the kind that invited honesty without demanding it. He spoke calmly, acknowledging the success of her leadership on the project, then paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "There's something I need to address," he said evenly, his tone careful but firm. "Not as a critique of your work, because your performance speaks for itself, but as a matter of environment and trust." Zoe felt her chest tighten, though she kept her posture steady, her hands folded neatly on the table. She had anticipated this moment without knowing when it would arrive, rehearsing responses she hoped she would never need. Julian continued, explaining that he had observed subtle changes in how others interacted with her, changes that did not align with the culture he intended to uphold. He did not accuse, did not speculate, but acknowledged that perception, once altered, could undermine even the strongest contributions if left unchallenged. Zoe listened in silence, her heart pounding not from fear of reprimand, but from the realization that the choice she had avoided was now unavoidable. The lie she had told in the hallway had grown beyond a single moment of self-protection. It had become a quiet force shaping how others viewed her, and how she viewed herself. She understood then that maintaining it no longer preserved her career as she had hoped. Instead, it eroded the very foundation she had worked so hard to build. When Julian finally asked if there was anything she wanted to clarify, his voice carried no pressure, only an openness that left the decision squarely in her hands. For a long moment, Zoe said nothing. She stared at the projection screen, the numbers blurring as her thoughts turned inward. She thought of the years she had spent proving her worth, of the sacrifices she had made to be taken seriously in rooms where doubt often arrived before respect. She thought of the fear that had guided her response in the hallway, and of the unintended consequences that followed. Most of all, she thought of the person she believed herself to be, someone who valued honesty not as an ideal, but as a practice. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though it carried a weight that surprised even her. "I wasn't entirely honest that day," Zoe admitted, meeting Julian's gaze directly. She did not rush to explain, nor did she dramatize the moment. She simply stated the truth she had avoided, acknowledging that her response had been driven by fear rather than necessity. She explained, without unnecessary detail, that she had chosen a convenient explanation to avoid scrutiny, believing it would protect her professionalism in an environment where assumptions could easily overshadow reality. As she spoke, she felt an unexpected sense of relief, as if releasing the truth loosened a tension she had carried longer than she realized. Julian listened without interruption, his expression composed but intent. When Zoe finished, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a measured breath, considering not just her words, but what they revealed about the pressures she navigated daily. He recognized the courage it had taken to speak openly, especially in a setting where power dynamics often discouraged vulnerability. When he finally replied, his tone was neither judgmental nor indulgent, but grounded in the values that defined his leadership. He acknowledged her fear as understandable, even if the choice it led to had complicated matters, and emphasized that integrity was not about never making mistakes, but about how one addressed them. The conversation did not end with resolutions or promises, but with mutual understanding. Julian made it clear that her honesty mattered, that her contributions were not diminished by a moment of hesitation, and that the responsibility for maintaining a fair and respectful environment did not rest on her shoulders alone. Zoe left the room that night feeling lighter, though uncertain of what lay ahead. She knew the truth did not automatically erase perception, nor did it guarantee immediate change. But it restored something more important than comfort: alignment between who she was and how she chose to act. As Zoe walked out into the quiet city streets, she understood that this was not the end of her challenge, but the beginning of a different kind of strength. She had faced the fear she once believed was necessary for survival and discovered that it had been holding her back more than protecting her. Whatever consequences followed, she knew she would meet them without hiding, guided by the same discipline that had carried her this far, now tempered with a courage she had finally claimed as her own. The truth, once spoken, did not explode through night global solutions the way Zoe Carter had once feared. It did not arrive as scandal or spectacle, nor did it unravel her career overnight. Instead, it moved quietly, almost invisibly, changing the internal gravity of her world in ways that were subtle but profound. Zoe returned to work the following morning with a strange sense of calm, not because she expected the road ahead to be easy, but because she no longer carried the exhausting burden of concealment. For the first time in weeks, she felt aligned with herself, her actions no longer at war with her values. That alignment gave her a steadiness that no amount of external validation ever had. Yet calm did not mean comfort. Zoe understood that honesty did not erase perception, and that leadership environments often responded slowly to truth, especially when narratives had already taken root. She noticed that while some colleagues interacted with her as they always had, others seemed unsure, recalibrating their behavior as if reassessing an equation they thought they had already solved. What changed most, however, was Zoe's response to that uncertainty. She no longer felt compelled to overperform to compensate for assumptions, nor did she shrink herself to avoid attention. She focused on clarity, on execution, on letting her work exist without apology. In doing so, she subtly shifted the dynamic around her, signaling that her confidence did not depend on approval. Julian Knight watched these changes with a measured sense of respect. He had not shared the details of their conversation, nor had he intended to. For him, leadership was not about broadcasting private moments, but about shaping systems that rewarded integrity and corrected imbalance. He began addressing broader cultural issues in meetings, reinforcing expectations around professionalism and respect without singling anyone out. His words were deliberate, carefully framed to remind everyone that speculation was not a substitute for evidence, and that performance, not perception, remained the standard by which contributions were judged. Those who listened closely understood the message. Those who did not felt its weight regardless. The project Zoe led reached its most critical phase during this period, demanding decisive action and clear authority. There were moments when resistance surfaced, thinly veiled as procedural concern or cautious questioning, yet Zoe navigated them with a calm assertiveness that left little room for doubt. She did not argue emotionally, nor did she defend herself personally. She relied on data, logic, and strategic foresight, dismantling objections with precision rather than force. Each successful decision reinforced her credibility, not because she was proving something to others, but because she was fully present in her role, no longer divided by fear. Privately, Zoe reflected often on the choice she had made to speak the truth. She recognized how close she had come to allowing fear to define her trajectory, and how easily she might have continued living behind a version of herself designed to feel safe rather than authentic. The realization was sobering. She understood now that survival-driven decisions, while sometimes necessary, could quietly transform into prisons if left unexamined. By choosing honesty, she had not guaranteed protection, but she had reclaimed agency, and that, she realized, was a form of power she had underestimated. Julian, too, found himself changed by the experience, though he expressed it differently. As a leader, he was accustomed to bearing responsibility for outcomes. Yet this situation reminded him that leadership also involved recognizing unseen pressures and responding with empathy rather than distance. He became more intentional in creating spaces where voices like Zoe's were not merely heard, but supported without qualification. Not through special treatment, but through consistency, transparency, and an unwillingness to tolerate subtle erosion of respect. In doing so, he reaffirmed his own principles, understanding that ethical leadership required continuous attention, not assumptions of fairness. The defining moment came during a company-wide review when Zoe presented the final results of the initiative she had led. The numbers spoke clearly, reflecting growth, efficiency, and strategic alignment that exceeded expectations. As she spoke, the room listened, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. When she finished, there was no hesitation, no awkward pause, only acknowledgement of work well done. Julian addressed the room afterward, commending the team while explicitly recognizing Zoe's leadership, framing it not as an exception, but as an example of what the organization valued. The message was unmistakable: competence and integrity were not negotiable, and they did not require justification. For Zoe, that moment was not about vindication, but about closure. She realized that the greatest shift had not occurred in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She no longer measured success solely by stability or safety, but by alignment between her actions and her principles. The fear that once guided her decisions had not vanished entirely, but it no longer held authority over her. She had learned that courage was not the absence of risk, but the willingness to face it without surrendering one's identity. As weeks passed, the tension that once shadowed her gradually dissolved, replaced by a quiet respect that felt earned rather than demanded. Zoe did not become more visible by seeking attention, but by standing firmly in her truth, allowing her work and integrity to coexist without compromise. She understood now that while she could not control every narrative, she could control how she responded to them, and that choice defined her far more than any moment of fear ever could. In choosing honesty over comfort, Zoe had not only protected her career, but strengthened it, laying a foundation built not on avoidance, but on self-respect. The path ahead remained complex, as all meaningful paths were, but she walked it with clarity, knowing that whatever challenges awaited, she would meet them without hiding, guided by a confidence that came not from approval, but from authenticity. The months that followed marked a turning point not only in Zoe Carter's career, but in the quiet architecture of her identity, the internal framework that guided how she measured success, worth, and courage. What began as a moment of fear in a hallway had evolved into a lesson that reshaped how she moved through the world, both professionally and personally. Zoe no longer viewed her journey as a fragile balance between survival and ambition. Instead, she understood it as a continuum, one where integrity was not a luxury reserved for safe moments, but a compass that guided her through uncertainty. This shift did not make her life easier, but it made it clearer, and clarity, she discovered, was a form of strength few truly possessed. Within Knight Global Solutions, the impact of Zoe's leadership became increasingly evident. The initiative she had guided to completion set a new benchmark for cross-functional collaboration, inspiring confidence across departments that had once operated in isolation. Her approach, grounded in logic yet tempered with empathy, influenced how teams communicated and how decisions were made. Zoe did not seek recognition, yet it found her in quiet ways. In colleagues who consulted her not out of obligation, but trust. In junior employees who saw in her a reflection of what disciplined perseverance could achieve. In meetings where her voice carried weight without needing volume. These moments affirmed what she had long believed but rarely allowed herself to feel, that her value was inherent, not conditional. Julian Knight observed this evolution with a sense of fulfillment that extended beyond quarterly reports or market growth. As a leader, he had always measured success by outcomes, yet this experience reminded him that culture was shaped just as much by individual courage as by policy. Zoe's journey reinforced his belief that ethical leadership was not about controlling narratives, but about creating environments where truth could surface without punishment. He continued to reinforce these values, not through grand declarations, but through consistent action, ensuring that performance reviews, promotions, and opportunities reflected merit rather than perception. In doing so, he strengthened not only the organization, but his own understanding of leadership as a living responsibility. For Zoe, the most profound change unfolded quietly, away from boardrooms and presentations. She found herself more at ease with uncertainty, less inclined to preemptively defend against outcomes that had not yet occurred. She recognized how much energy she had once devoted to managing fear, to anticipating judgment, to shaping herself into what she believed was safest rather than what was most true. Letting go of that vigilance did not make her careless, it made her present. She engaged more fully, listened more openly, and allowed herself to exist without constantly calculating the cost of authenticity. This internal freedom became the foundation for a confidence that no external approval could grant or revoke. As time passed, The hallway incident faded into memory, no longer a defining moment, but a catalyst that had revealed deeper truths. Zoe did not regret her initial fear, nor did she dwell on the lie that had followed. She understood now that growth rarely emerged from perfection, but from reflection and choice. What mattered was not that she had faltered, but that she had corrected her course with intention. That realization softened her judgment of herself and others, reminding her that resilience was not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to learn from them without losing one's core. The organization, too, evolved in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations became more direct, assumptions were challenged more openly, and leadership at all levels began to reflect the values Julian had long championed. Zoe's presence played a role in that shift, not because she demanded change, but because she embodied it. Her journey became an unspoken reference point, a reminder that integrity could withstand scrutiny, and that professionalism did not require self-erasure. In this way, her impact extended beyond her role, influencing a culture that would outlast any single project or individual. On a quiet evening, long after the building had emptied, Zoe stood by the same hallway where everything had once unraveled, now feeling a sense of distance from the fear that had gripped her then. The space looked the same, yet she was not. She understood now that the greatest rise of her life had not been marked by promotions or accolades, but by an internal shift, a decision to align her actions with her values even when it felt unsafe. That choice had not only protected her career, it had restored her sense of self. Zoe left the building that night with an unburdened stride, carrying nothing she needed to hide. She knew the world would continue to present challenges, that perceptions would still fluctuate, and that courage would be required again in different forms. But she also knew she was capable of meeting those moments without retreating into fear. Her story was no longer defined by what had fallen in a hallway, but by what she had chosen to stand for afterward. And in that choice, she had found not just success, but a quiet, enduring dignity that would guide her forward, wherever her path might lead.